Hi, I'm Femi OK, and you're in the stream. Today, China's impact in Africa. We'll look at how Chinese trade and investments are changing the continent. So our international online community are very into this topic from all over the world. They have lots of things to say. What do you have, Malika?
Right, so they are tweeting us from different countries on the African continent, and it's interesting hearing their different perspectives. Some of them look like this. This is out of Malawi. This is Sindhu, who's tweeting to the stream, answering the question, what does the relationship of China with your country mean? Sindhu says, it means the exploitation of our precious minerals, joblessness of our people, loss of land, and the slaughter of our prized wildlife. On the other hand, out of Ethiopia, you get this comment from Haile Mikhail, who says, China means everything here. They're changing history of economic cooperation, loans, trade, tech, know-how, etc. So we know you have something to say on this topic, and you can share your thoughts with us with hashtag AJStream.
嗨，大家好，我是陈君，我在 The Stream。
China has been a major force in building economic growth for many African nations. The Asian superpower is the continent's largest trading partner and has been boosting its investments in exchange for natural resources. China aims to provide $1 trillion in financing to Africa by 2025, much of it for infrastructure projects like roads and railways and airports. But as business ties deepen, who benefits from the China-Africa relationship? With us to talk more about this in Accra, Ghana, Buddy Buruku is an entrepreneur and co-founder of Kuku Quality, a poultry farm in Uganda. Buddy is also a country program manager for the African Center for Economic Transformation. In Nairobi, Kenya, Jinghao Lu is a project manager with the Sino-Africa Center for Excellence Foundation. In Johannesburg, South Africa, Richard Poplak, a correspondent for South Africa's Daily Maverick news website, is also working on a new book about China-Africa relations. And in Accra, Ghana, Samlara Ba, an entrepreneur and founder of the sanitation startup company Lu Works. Good to have you here, everybody. Buddy, when you went shopping for equipment for your business, where did you go?
Well, I had to do a lot of research first to find out where would be the best place to go. Some people may not know this, but in China, a lot of industries are concentrated around certain cities, provinces. So I actually ended up in Nanjing, which is sort of my first venture into China anyway, so it's like a homecoming for me.
Right.
Most of the poultry farms and the equipment is based in Nanjing, so my partner and I went there.
All right, and you got the best deal. You looked around the world and you felt, okay, this is the best deal, this is a good fit for me.
Well, I mean, I had to consider a number of things. I'm not a poultry expert by training, so I had to think about sort of balancing between having the right amount of technology and making use of, you know, a good, strong agricultural labor force in my country. So I looked around, I compared countries, and ultimately I went with the Chinese. As you know, everything is made in China, so you can get various levels of quality there as well.
So have a look here on my laptop. I was looking, Richard, at your Twitter feed today, and I found a retweet here from Ray Hartley. It says here, China in Africa, it's complicated. So Richard, to give us a sense of the kinds of businesses, the kind of investment that's coming into China, I know it's complicated. We look to see around Africa who doesn't have a relationship with China, and there are only one or two countries, if that don't have some kind of ties with China. Can you give us a sense of the kind of business that's being done?
The business, I mean, it cuts across all sectors and all walks of life. The way I like to explain it to people, I think, is you have to look at it from the sort of business to business level, where you have this very well-conceived interaction between the 1.4 billion people in China and the 1.1 billion people in Africa. And all of this was kind of designed at a government-to-government level. There's a multilateral organization called the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, and that was set up by the Chinese in 1999 and 2000 to really engage with all of the countries in Africa. Then you have the small traders, people who come by themselves to come and work in Africa, or to go over to China to make purchases, like we just heard. And then you have the gangsters who come to fleece the joint. So there's just a little bit of everything. It's this really, really rich interaction and this massive, massive epochal encounter that really is changing both entities, I think.
Sure.
And it really sounds like what you're saying is that it runs the gamut, and that's what we're hearing from our community online also. So this example out of Nigeria, Ade says, lots of Chinese-owned companies provide thousands of employment opportunities, but most of that employment is low-wage jobs. On the other hand, hearing out from someone out of Kenya, this is Kevin, who says, new rail project aided by the Chinese and Kenyan government. It's estimated to cut travel time by half. You can see a picture there. He goes on to show another example, saying they've helped us leap forward in infrastructure, especially here in Kenya. 10 years ago, we didn't have flyovers, and you can see the highways there. So, Jinghao, you are in Nairobi. What's the scale of the projects that you are seeing in Kenya?
Yeah, definitely. In these several years, China got some of the largest projects that the East Africa communities together are trying to link the whole regions with each other. So from Lamu Port to Nairobi to Mombasa to Dar es Salaam all the way to Kigali in Rwanda, we're seeing that China's involvement across various regions, sectors from port to road to oil pipeline and water system and so on. So the involvement is really large in scale. The recent report by Deloitte pointed out that in East Africa, 30% of the infrastructure projects were addressed by Chinese companies in 2014, as compared to only less than 20% by EU and US.
So I'm just looking at Samlara's face. Samlara, you're looking a little cynical as we're talking about China right now. Am I reading your face correctly?
Not entirely. I think I'd agree with Richard and say that it's complicated. I certainly agree that there are pros and cons regarding investment into any developing nation. And with regard to Chinese investment, yes, we've seen great opportunities with regard to infrastructure. And as the tweet said, I think it was Ade, it's true. There are loads of jobs created. However, they do tend to be the lowest wage jobs, and they don't tend to allow much room for elevation.
Samlara, but would these jobs exist without this investment, this exchange, this trade? Would people be unemployed instead?
That's a touchy subject because it's possible, yes, that they could be unemployed. Anyone could argue that. However, investment in allowing, some would say allowing local producers or pushing for some type of fairness with regard to labor practices might also help your citizenry.
All right.
Femi, if I could just jump in here.
Yeah, please, buddy, go ahead.
I mean, the Chinese have been in Africa for many, many decades, but what we don't see is the growth of Chinese-based companies that have grown with the economies, that have grown in size in terms of their engagement with local populations, in terms of their technology transfer and skills transfer. There's been enough time in this relationship between African countries and China for that to happen, if that was the intention of most Chinese companies on the continent. What we are seeing, as was discussed, is this huge infrastructure boom, which is absolutely necessary. The West is not capable, nor does it have the appetite to step in to address the infrastructure deficit on the continent. And we are very grateful for that. But there's several other industries, manufacturing, for example, which has the greatest contribution towards employment generation. That is where we'd really like to see more Chinese engagement.
Jinghao, how would you respond to... Go ahead, Richard, then I'll bring Jinghao in. Richard.
Yeah. I think this is exactly where we need to start drilling down to the specifics. I think there are African countries that have done very well to start capturing the manufacturing jobs. But that really needs to happen at the African labor law level. It really needs to happen at the African level. An example of a country that's done an excellent job of capturing a lot of the manufacturing jobs that are leaving the Chinese mainland. And here's a little fact just to keep in mind. There have been, over the course of the Industrial Revolution, there have been 10 million manufacturing jobs on the African continent. If we were to capture, as a continent, the roughly 80 million jobs that are leaving the Chinese mainland, the 80 million low-skilled manufacturing jobs, if we were to capture 10% of that, we would, in a decade, double the amount of manufacturing jobs on this continent. Now, that's a terrifying statistic, and it shows you what a poor job African countries actually have done at building their manufacturing sectors. So like I was saying, Ethiopia is an example of a country that's done a fantastic job. South Africa is an example of a country that's done a very poor job. Our manufacturing sector has been completely gutted. Yes, it is largely because of big geopolitical factors, but I think a lot of the responsibility has to lie with African governments.
Richard, for those of us who don't know South Africa well, how's your manufacturing industry been totally gutted? Do you want to explain that a little further?
It has over the last 15 years, and again, I'm going to say it's complicated, and not to drill down into too many of the sort of nuts and bolts. But yes, there's pressure from low-cost Chinese goods. I mean, that's happened all over the world. But our labor laws are restrictive here, and for a lot of good reasons. But again, you look to Ethiopia, which has been very, very aggressive at setting up the kind of conditions where the manufacturing sector can boom. And again, you as a country, you have to ask: do you want these low-skilled jobs? Do you want these poorly paid jobs? All of these are very, very difficult questions to ask, but they need to be asked.
Well, Samlara, there's something here I want to direct to you online, because this is something that so many people are telling us. This is a tweet out of Malawi. This is Joy, who says, the Chinese have good infrastructure improvement projects, but local participation has to improve, and locals often are being sidelined. That's echoed here. This is a tweet from Nigeria. Jeff says, any investment that's not geared towards growing local content, adding value to the country, is deceptive investment. So strong words there, Samlara, but you as an entrepreneur, do you find that to be true, that there's not enough local investment?
I certainly agree. I mean, to a certain degree, especially if we're talking regarding that tweet, if we're saying that, let's use the bottom of the pyramid, for example. If we're saying that a lot of these workers are coming from the bottom of the pyramid, are we elevating them at all? Are we working to create jobs that are going to allow them more resources, more opportunities, or are we going to ensure that they're staying exactly where they are? And I do feel, from my perspective, within sanitation, as we look ahead at growing within manufacturing specifically, I currently consult with Biophil.com, and we're fearful with regard to opening a factory or even growing that manufacturing leg out right now, simply because though the Chinese investment has taken manufacturing to new heights on the continent and within country, it's also stunted the growth of some local manufacturers, as Richard said. And we've noticed in our industry in particular that we're hesitant to create factories, and instead we'd like to create multiple artisans that can work together to create our finished products, simply because we're then able to spread out profit and a sense of ownership among our local talent. And I think we're stunting our growth to a certain level when we say that, oh, all these jobs have been created, but what happens to the citizenry afterwards? Are we looking long term?
Jinghao, how do you address these very real concerns of local communities about what investment from China may do?
Right. So I think while the media is capturing a lot about these big projects, infrastructure projects employing thousands of people who are not necessarily the highest pay workers, we need to, there are 2 points I really want to address first, to lay out my opinions in the future. Is one, that we need to see that there are trends of more Chinese companies coming to Africa and need to build their own brand. So if you're looking for Chinese equipment companies and the Chinese IT companies like Huawei, these companies are truly interested in localize their business, and they want their brand to be known as an international brand rather than Chinese brand. So in these companies, you will clearly see the trend that, one, they're trying to replace as many local workers and managers, replace as many Chinese managers into locals. And second, that they're setting up a lot of training schools and technical colleges aiming at as a CSR, but more like laying for the future for the transformation of the company into a more localized one. So I'm seeing more and more these examples in Nairobi, where Chinese companies are refusing to call themselves Chinese, where they want to be local. The other part I want to point out is that even for these largest infrastructure companies that I'm seeing across the continent, at least in 3 countries I traveled to, I realized that they are not interested in really bringing a lot of Chinese people to work on the projects unless there's a strict deadline they have to meet, or the work associated is with certain criteria that they feel only the engineers from China can meet. But if they can address the projects in local content, they would rather do it, because we have done research recently at the SACE Foundation that we found out Chinese company usually pay 6 times more in bringing a Chinese skilled worker in the continent than hiring one locally. Then we need to ask ourselves why they're not actually practicing that enough. Is that a cultural reason for not being able to communicate well between the managers or headquarters and the local managers?
Why do you think that is? You've been doing this quite a lot, between working with Chinese investors and different countries around the African continent. Why do you think that is? Is it a cultural issue? Is it about not integrating enough, being a little worried about what the local community might be able to do for you as a business? What would you say?
I think it's a great question, and I have been thinking about this
It was your question
for a while.
It's a good question.
Yeah. So if we look at the Chinese companies and the Chinese managers coming to the African continent, many of them have never been to countries outside of China before, and they came to Africa looking for fortune or earning a good salary. That's why we see a lot of young people managing the projects, very significant projects in the continent from China. So a lot of them are still in the beginning stage. Some of them speak good English. Many of them probably speak not very good English, but more importantly, they don't have a very good multicultural understanding. They're not involved in that culture in China. So when it's down to dealing with Africans, a lot of time they're very inward, and they tend to feel more comfortable with themselves. That being said, I think it's slowly changing with more Chinese companies that are trying to push a very big sales team and want the Chinese people to be very integrated in the local community. We're going to see a trend of, but it's going to take years for this to happen. But I'm confident that this is the direction where it's going.
Well, picking up on what you said, Jinghao, about being integrated in local communities, we actually got a video comment from Sarah out of the Democratic Republic of Congo. And I'm going to pose this to you, Richard. Have a listen to this.
There is something to be said about how Chinese companies adapt so quickly. For example, they speak the local language. They are not limited in living in some of the nicest area of the town. They really go out there and live in the communities where they work. And this capacity is really enabling Chinese investment to deliver in places where traditional donors have been struggling for the past 50 years. There is something to be said about how it's so interesting that people are responding more favorably to this direct approach that is less patronizing and more mutually beneficial.
So Richard, in her experience, she's saying this has been beneficial and interesting because it hasn't been done in the past.
Yeah, I think Sarah makes some really interesting points, and I would agree with her in the Democratic Republic of the Congo context. I think Chinese firms working there have done a better job than they have done elsewhere. I've been looking at this phenomenon for the past 6-7 years quite closely. I've been to a number of these big work sites, and I know we're concentrating on that right now, and we perhaps shouldn't be, because the phenomenon is much wider than that. But on these big work sites, these big infrastructure projects, I sat down with a manager of a dam, a Sino-Hydro project in Botswana. He said when he first got to Africa, he was afraid to shake hands with the locals because he was nervous of catching AIDS. That kind of cultural misunderstanding really was pervasive throughout the entire structures in Sino-Hydro in Botswana, and they had a really hard time at integrating within the community, and eventually Sino-Hydro was actually kicked out of Botswana. They no longer work there. That proved to be a disaster for one of China's largest SOEs. And it's indicative of the kind of cultural issues that we've been talking about. These cultural barriers are very, very real. But Sarah is absolutely correct in saying that many companies have been very, very swift at sort of evolving and saying, oh, okay, well, we have these cultural constraints. We have to break these barriers down. How do we do better? How do we get better? How do we advance this stuff?
Let me show you some. Yeah, go ahead, buddy.
Sorry if I may. I wanted actually, Richard, to expound a little bit more in terms of smaller companies doing that. It's true that you will find Chinese entrepreneurs operating in the most obscure, rural, forsaken areas of many African countries. But I don't know to what extent they're doing that in an integrated manner with the actual local communities. How much are they employing outsiders? Because I have been in a situation where I got out off a plane that was coming from Addis, transiting in Addis, coming from Beijing, and had to help several people go through the immigration process because it was clear to me that they hadn't even reached the high school level, but were coming into Ghana in order to have jobs in very hinterland areas, parts of Chinese companies. So I'm curious, since you've been specifically looking at this issue, yes, with the larger companies such as the one that you mentioned, there is almost a political incentive to be more engaged, to be more, to reach out their hand, because that is in part the Chinese government's directive. But for those Chinese who come to Africa without even the knowledge of the Chinese government, which, to be frank, is happening very much so now. Are you seeing any evidence of this happening, this like hand-holding, this joint ventureship, this integration? I'm not sure I am.
Richard?
No, and I would agree with you. I think I would say that from my research and the research of a number of others, when you look at the larger projects, it's roughly one Chinese national to 5 locals. That's pretty much the average. When you start looking at the much smaller companies, I would say that entirely disappears. What you're talking about is companies that, or individuals that are working entirely outside of labor regulations. Small companies that don't pay any tax, that probably aren't registered in many cases. They exist, they function in a gray zone, and that gray zone is outside of any sort of labor norms. And certainly in the South African context, I would say that very small Chinese, what we call here spaza shops, small shops, may hire a local here or there. How much money they actually pump into the economy in terms of employment, I would argue it's negligible.
Let me show you something here on my laptop. It's from a Chinese news website called Douyi News. And here we've got an illustration. So you have Africa here, which says Africa. Then we have fish. This is the fishing rod. And here we have China. And so the inference here in this illustration is that China is bringing both fish and also the fishing rod, so the means and also some aid as well. Jinghao, is that how you see China's relationship with the African continent?
Yeah, so I think just to take from the previous conversations, I think when we talk about China-Africa relationship, we need to be very cautious or be very open to different scenarios. There are on top level government-led government-led cooperation that is always very benevolent and looking for always transferring skills, exchange of knowledge, and the aid and training the officials. At the mid-level, we have the state-owned enterprises that are trying to act on behalf of the state will, sure. And also
Jinghao, we're in the closing seconds of this show. So the relationship for you, somebody who's worked really hard to bring China into the African continent, in a sentence, what would it be?
It's a very complicated, and on the higher level, it looks like a mutually beneficial relationship. But on the grassroots level, it's very complicated. We have very smart entrepreneurs who are very localized.
Badi Baruku, Richard Poplack, and Samlara Bar. We're going to take you to the post show. Thank you for your insights about Africa and China and their business relationship. Thanks for watching. Hello there, welcome back to the Post Show. We're talking about China and also the African continent and investment and trade there. I'm going to actually start with Malika. You had a lot of comments about, what would I say, technology and quality and goods available.
Exactly, and it's something that, Richard, you'd mentioned a little bit earlier. People are picking up on that. And these are in the view of it being favorable. So Laseni says, with Chinese, 2 out of 3 Africans have a phone. Many have computers and luxury goods. Another person writes in this from Ghana, Kukua, says, there's a huge market for affordable made in China electronics in Ghana. And that's something ordinary citizens benefit from. She goes on to say, there are Ghanaian traders who travel to China frequently to bring affordable goods from furniture to phones to our markets. So, Buddy, you are in Ghana. Do you see this as favorably as Kukua does?
I have to agree with Kukwa that the advent or the access to China allows for people who would otherwise not have these goods the opportunity to have them. So, we shouldn't, as people who've always had mobile phones, judge those who would now have the opportunity to have cheap ones. That's great. And that's something that we should continue to promote. But on the higher level, the governments of Africa have a responsibility to make sure that the developments that happen in Chinese and African trade and investment have a long-term, sustainable, beneficial outcome for the population. So we shouldn't just look in the short term. Although there are short-term benefits, but ultimately the role of an African government is to look out for its African sustainability. And that, thankfully, has a mutual benefit with Chinese sustainability, but ultimately we need to look out for ourselves first.
See, Richard,
I have to agree with Buddy, if I may.
Yeah, go ahead.
If I may add to that.
Yeah, go ahead.
I have to agree wholeheartedly that yes, to a certain degree, we have to ensure that we are understanding there's more access to goods, and we have to be open to that, because we may have always had that cell phone, as Buddy said. But I'm curious as to that overwhelming imbalance in the amount of profits taken back to China as opposed to remaining locally. In addition, just our Chinese investors, the CSR that Richard mentioned earlier, what type of timeline would he imagine that would actually happen locally on continent?
Well, when we're talking about CSR, I think we're talking about a specific sort of shift in a particular corporation's corporate culture, and I think that would depend from corporation to corporation. At a certain point, we as global citizens became addicted to really, really cheap stuff. Most of that cheap stuff has been made in China up until now. Many of those low-skilled manufacturing jobs are leaving the continent. They're going to Vietnam, they're going to Ethiopia, they're going to elsewhere. Some of our countries here in Africa may capture some of those jobs, some of them may not. The point is that so long as we maintain this addiction to cheap stuff, we're going to need some places to make that cheap stuff cheaply. And so we roll into this really, really sort of complicated geopolitical situation where our wants and our needs, our consumer cultures, sort of run up against where this stuff is made. And I think that's one of the issues that have sort of complicated the China conundrum. When it comes to cell phones, the profits go all over the world. Very, very small portion of those profits remain with the African retailer. So again, for us, until we actually start making stuff, designing stuff, innovating, those sustainable solutions that Buddy was mentioning just are completely out of reach. We have to start improving on our innovation sector, our education sectors, and all of that stuff before we can properly start talking about sustainable solutions, in my opinion.
See, Jinghao, when companies approach you or business approaches you and says, I'd like to actually work in Africa, what do you tell them? Where do you start with them?
I think a lot of companies coming to explore opportunities have very little understanding of the continent itself, and I will throw some ideas and the countries, and they couldn't really find on the map. So we had to start in the beginning to try and understand the difference between East Africa and West Africa's demands, consumer groups, and the regulations that facilitating such opportunities are different. So we end up starting from the beginning and lay out different industries and different opportunities.
Sure. Wow, that's almost like Africa 101. What's the first lesson in that lesson?
I think the most important thing is to understand if there's a market for such products. I think the beginning thinking for many Chinese companies into Africa is to think about how to sell their products into the continent.
All right, okay, I see, Jinghao, I get, Jinghao, I get this. All right, so what is the most inappropriate product that came to you and you thought, that is never going to sell anywhere across the 54 countries. Nowhere, no one is going to buy this. You don't have to tell us the company, just tell us the product. You don't have to say the brand. He's like,
I actually couldn't really think about it. I think anything I see here makes sense because I see that in China, and I feel the locals actually in Africa they would also find it useful. I think one example was the cell phone mobile charger, which is so popular in China. Now I see it everywhere in Nairobi because people now realize that smartphone needs to be powered everywhere, anytime. And that thing I see successfully transferred from China into Africa.
Yes, Jinghao, but that was not my question. My question was, what was an unsuccessful suggestion that you just did a face palm and just thought, this is not going to work? You don't understand the market. You don't have to say any names. I'm just intrigued as to what the product might have been. You know it's happened.
Right.
While you're thinking about that, Malika's going to ask another question. I'll come back to you. Malika.
Well, this is picking up on understanding the market. It's not a fail, but this is an idea on Twitter. This person says, you tell the Chinese you want a road from point A to point B, and they ask you when you want them to start. If you ask that to the EU or the USA, a feasibility study takes 5 years. And I see you laughing there, Richard, but this comment is kind of reiterated here on Facebook. This is Philip. He says, yes, the Chinese are not doing business in Africa out of the goodness of their hearts, but they're better partners for Africa than the West has ever been. You find some truth in that?
Yeah, I mean, I love the feasibility study thing. It's very, very true. That said, there's something to be said for feasibility studies. There is a big difference between a good road and a bad road. Unfortunately, I think we know that a lot of the Chinese infrastructure on this continent has been very, very shoddy. But I also think that second tweet was 100% right. I think the hunger for Chinese SOEs to build massive infrastructure projects on the continent has been very political and has benefited the Chinese, the Chinese in the eyes of African nations to a very, very great extent. But I also think it's shunted African countries forward in a way that the West was just never able or willing to do.
You talked about Ethiopia as being somewhere where this relationship works really well. Can you give us a couple of examples in Ethiopia, Richard?
Well, the previous president, Meles Zenawi, was something of a genius at playing off the West and the East. Following the bloody elections of 2005, what Meles Zenawi did was sort of restructure how European and American aid gets funneled into the country, and he sort of balanced that off with the Chinese aid. In effect, what he was saying was, if you want to play with Ethiopia, you have to pay to play with Ethiopia. And he did an excellent job at sort of maintaining the sort of enmity between the two while making sure that the money came in from both. With
Richard,
regard to the Chinese,
I would argue
there's a fantastic sort of local railway that's been built in Addis Ababa off Chinese funds and with Chinese infrastructure. That's just one example. There are many. Bole Road, the main road in Addis Ababa, there's been a couple of fits and starts with that. I wouldn't call it the finest highway in the world, or at least byway, but there it is.
Buddy wants to argue with you, Richard. Buddy?
No, I don't want to argue. I said I would also argue that Meles has the right approach, and every African president
100%
has the ability to think through what he or she needs, to strategize on what he or she is willing to give up, and to drive a harder bargain with the Chinese. I mean, in my experience, Chinese representatives arrive with geothermal maps, like mapping of things with, the amount of data which they present the African counterparts with, they really are woefully unprepared and thus unable to negotiate any decent packages. And Melis was definitely not this way. Melis knew what he wanted, knew what he could,
The only reason
leverage.
I didn't use genius with regard to Melis is because I was going to get flamed online from a bunch of Ethiopians in the
He's a genius.
That is the only reason I didn't.
Yes, Richard, that is definitely going to happen. We
Bring it
speak
on.
from personal experience. See, I think perceptions are very interesting because there's reality and then there's perceptions and then there's business, which, it's a whole different level of conversation. But Jinghao, to you, as you live in Nairobi, you're based there in Kenya, how do people behave to you? How accepting are they?
Yeah, I think Nairobi being an international hub for a lot of non-governmental organizations definitely helps people's perception to me. So I would give example of my encountering some other, for example, Western African country, I wouldn't name the name, that I go into one lane and I see all the kids trying to do Kung Fu movement to me. And as a way they just perceive Chinese people as to be. But in Nairobi, I found like people actually just, really try to understand my culture and they treat me with respect. And I found a very internationalized community of Nairobi people that who I actually found like the social circle is there. I think in Kenya, generally Chinese are welcomed and well perceived, and then I would give a credit also to Kenyan people. They're really friendly.
They are really friendly. Let me just look here at your Twitter feed here. You've got a quote here from the former Tanzanian Minister of Energy and Minerals, and he's explaining the China-Africa friendship. And on your tweet here, there's a picture. It says, "What is a friend?" And he quotes Aristotle. He said, "A friend is one soul inhabiting two bodies, Africa and China." So that's how he sees the relationship. We started off with, if Africa was in a bar, what would China be? But how would you characterize, Buddy, this relationship?
A marriage with all of its ups and downs.
Oh, is it a keeper though, Buddy? Forever? To death do
I
you
think
part?
so. I think so.
That's romantic.
Definitely, death do us part.
All
Absolutely.
right.
And then once one person dies, then the person remarries. And then it's the next man.
I wonder who they get married to again. That's a whole different show. Okay, Jinghao, we dipped into your Twitter feed, so I've got the here, one soul inhabiting two bodies. Richard, for you, this relationship, what's it like?
That's a bit sentimental for me. I'm going to stick with, I like what Buddy said. It's, when the marriage ends, you move on. And that's exactly how African countries and any multilateral African body needs to think, completely pragmatically, coldly, and with our, as African citizens, with our best interests at heart.
Sure. Samlara.
I think I wouldn't go as far as marriage. I would go a long-term relationship, definitely, that tends to have its ups and downs. It's tumultuous at times, but nevertheless, there's good for at least one party involved.
Very interesting. Thank you very much, guests. I'm going to stop off with Malika before I wrap up. Malika?
This is how Babs on Twitter would sum up the relationship. He says, it's a win-win unless China's winning a little bit more, but most Africans like me, he says, can live with that.
So Buddy Baruku, Jinghao Lu, Richard Poplak and Samlara Ba, thank you for being part of this conversation. We really appreciated your time today. Thanks for watching.